since 2010, when she was awarded a PhD scholarship to study at the Victoria University of Wellington. She holds a BA in French language and literature from the University of Illinois at Chicago, and a Master of Library and Information Science from McGill University, Montreal. Her PhD explored how people from non-Western cultures engage with information. Since completing her PhD in 2013, she has worked as a lecturer in Library and Information Studies at the Open Polytechnic of New Zealand and Te Puna Mātauranga o Aotearoa, the National Library of New Zealand. Nicole is also a practicing artist in ceramics, and the intersection of culture, information, and equity continues to be of interest throughout her art practice and professional work. Over to you, Nicole.
Kia ora. Hi, everybody. I'm just going to... Kia ora. So, thanks for that introduction, and thanks for organizing this. I know we're running a little bit over time, so I'm just going to try and go quickly. So kia ora, I'm Nicole Gaston. I'm the Librarian Research Coordinator at Toi Whakaari, and I'm going to be talking today about some work we've been doing on a new master's program here at Toi Whakaari. And just a heads up, I'm going to be using quite a bit of Te Reo Maori in this presentation, so I'll try and translate where necessary, because I understand most of you are Australian, but if there are any words that you're not familiar with, please stop me and tell me, and I'll translate. So, Toi Whakaari is New Zealand's national performing arts tertiary education organization, established in 1970. We're pretty small. We've got 25 full-time staff and around 120 students in a range of undergraduate programs. So it's acting, design, arts management, costume, and set and props. And since 2021, our strategic plan has had a focus on decolonizing the Kura. So Kura is Maori for school. So decolonizing the school has been part of our focus, alongside revealing and connecting Aotearoa story makers, opening up the future and potential of performance practice. So from 2000 to 2014, we offered a Master of Theatre Arts program with a focus in directing, which was jointly offered with Victoria University of Wellington. But in 2014, Vic made the decision to stop running that program, which I understand is mostly based on kind of financial cost and low number of students. So the closure of that MTA program left a gap in terms of practice-based postgrad study for the performing arts in New Zealand. Today, there are a limited number of options for people who do want to do postgraduate qualifications in performing arts. You can do an MFA at a few different places, and you can do MA degrees with a focus in theater or film and those kinds of things. At a few different institutions, but there's nothing that's specifically practice-based and performance art. So thinking around the potential to offer a new postgrad qualification began almost immediately after the closure of that of the MTA program here in 2014. Lots of different ideas and iterations floated around, but it wasn't until 2021 that planning and development on a new qualification really began in earnest, which is around the same time that we developed this plan, part of our strategic plan around decolonizing the school. So as development began on the program, we intentionally wanted to reflect on what research means in a decolonized performing arts context, given our strategic focus. The development of the program drew on the approaches taken by our undergraduate programs that interpret decolonization in different ways, but always with the aim of preparing our students to create authentic and impactful art as story makers. So again, just going back to our strategic plan. So we reveal and connect Aotearoa story makers from our whare, which is building, standing on the whenua, which is the land, in Te Whanganui Aotearoa, which is Wellington. So place is very important to us here. We nurture talented students in performance arts through innovative, co-creative, and recognized learning programs to realize their creative potential and navigate sustainable paths forward. So that's from our strategic plan for 2022 to 2027. Part of that plan also includes the goal that by 2033, we will be a home for Te Ao Maori, so that's Maori worldview, framed creative learning and development practice, playing a leading role in our global region and beyond. So you can see that that's it's very aspirational, but there's definitely an explicit focus on indigeneity and decolonization and Te Ao Maori, which is important to us here. So one thing that I was quite aware of when we began work on developing this program, as an academic librarian, as a former lecturer, I am keenly aware of how knowledge and power is privileged within tertiary education. And I knew it was important to ensure an inclusive approach recognized that higher education institutions today exclude many of the diverse knowledge systems in the world, including those of Indigenous peoples and excluded racial groups, as well as those excluded on the basis of gender, class, or sexuality. So that's from Hall 2017. But there's actually a huge body of work going back decades exploring the decolonization of knowledge or epistemological decolonization, often with an emphasis on critiquing academia. So one of the goals of the new program is to actively recruit students that are interested in engaging with this decolonization process and exploring identity and place as part of their performance practice. So that meant that the thread of decolonization really needs to be woven throughout the program and its development down to the core of, again, how research was defined and enabled at an institutional level. This has often been problematic, as Tuck and Yang point out. Settler perspectives and worldviews get to count as knowledge and research, and how these perspectives are repackaged as data and findings are activated in order to rationalize and maintain unfair social structures. So essentially what they're doing is they're critiquing the fact that there is a self-perpetuating system, that Western knowledge is uplifted because it's counted as research, and that's used to actually further oppress Indigenous people and knowledge. There we go. All right, so knowledge democracy is an area of research that looks at how multiple knowledge systems, such as organic, spiritual, and land-based systems, frameworks arising from social movements, and the knowledge of marginalized or excluded people are important. It's also about open access for the sharing of knowledge, making it a powerful tool for taking action in social movements to deepen democracy and struggle for a fairer, healthier world. So there is even a critique of capitalism within this knowledge democracy theory, which I'm not going to go into today, because if you get me started talking about critiquing capitalism, we'll be here all day. So with kind of that in mind, how do we develop a school-wide research strategy? So as I contributed to the development of the program, it was important for me to recognize the role the library played in uplifting and reinforcing hegemonic structures of knowledge production. So what we really want to do is reject and dismantle the Western hegemony of knowledge production, the Western control on what counts and does not count as knowledge. So I approached this with the aim of avoiding implicit elevation of Western values while attempting to critically reflect on how we defined what does and doesn't count as knowledge in the school. And a big part of that is actually around the library and the role of the librarian. I think that libraries have a huge role to play in this. For example, terms like literature review and even the word research can be quite loaded and have implicit bias. So I opted for language like environmental scan or knowledge generation or innovation, those kinds of words that aren't tied to this, what I think most people think of research as this very explicit kind of Western oriented knowledge generation. So especially with literature reviews, they're often seen as the only way as the only legitimate evidence of investigation, which reinforces the settler colonial narrative of othering and discounting non-Western and Indigenous methodologies, worldviews, and ways of knowing, as well as embodied and practice-based research. So I feel like it's important to point out that obviously I'm approaching this from my own perspective, which, I'm an immigrant to New Zealand with mixed European heritage, working in a system that, while we do aspire to be Te Maori led, currently we're predominantly working in English and a European oriented system. But it's important to point out that no one can exist aculturally or ahistorically. So everyone will approach their own scenario and observe it based on their own perspectives and experiences, which is informed by the social, cultural, and legislative context that they're working in. So that kind of brings me to the New Zealand context and a little bit about the government system here, which I think probably most people are aware of. The strategic role the colonial settler government played in systematically devaluing and disrupting Indigenous ways of living and worldviews as a means of extracting wealth for European economies, not just in New Zealand, but worldwide. In New Zealand, this was particularly evident through large-scale land confiscations throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. And as you can see today, Indigenous people have some of the lowest rates of net worth today, which has been commented on by various sources. Maori once owned all of the land in Aotearoa. Today, many thousands of tangata whenua, which is another word for Maori people, which literally means people of the land, lack land. So while outright land confiscations may no longer be acceptable, current systems of government do continue to uphold this, especially in terms of educational funding and how that is reinforced. But changes are being made. So quickly, I just was going to talk about how, until very recently, alongside kind of ancient Egypt and English monarchies, there was not an explicit mandate to teach New Zealand histories in primary and secondary schools in New Zealand. However, starting from next year, this will be explicit. And so there's a refresh of the national curriculum, which includes, will make the new curriculum will teach Aotearoa New Zealand histories in all primary and secondary schools from 2023, including deep dives into Ngā Pakanga o Aotearoa, the New Zealand Wars, with specific discussion, and this is what I think is quite important, specific discussion of the intergenerational dispossession and denigration of Mātauranga Maori, so that's Maori knowledge and Indigenous worldviews, as a result of colonialism. So I do think this is quite promising that is going to be made explicitly part of the educational curriculum in primary and secondary schools. So that is, obviously it's a movement, it's a step towards this decolonization of knowledge and learning. But tertiary education institutions are funded in a way that also continues to uphold our Eurocentric knowledge systems. So in Aotearoa, we have a contestable research fund. So this is called the Performance-Based Research Fund that's administered by the Tertiary Education Commission. And this is, so the more kind of research outputs that a tertiary organization has, the more money they can get for that. And as part of that process in applying for that funding, faculty and research students are required to submit evidence portfolios of research outputs that they've created during the period. So I think the next fund is going to be in 2026. So it's around 6 years between funding rounds. And this is very much aligned with what the government defines as research. So this is taken from the Tertiary Education Commission. So for the purposes of the PBRF, the Performance-Based Research Fund, research is an original investigation undertaken in order to contribute to knowledge and understanding, and in the case of some disciplines, cultural innovation or aesthetic refinement. So they do talk a little bit about how it doesn't have to be a journal article. It can be it can be an artistic work, but it does need to be open to scrutiny and formal evaluation by others in the field, which can be achieved through publication or public presentation. So again, it can be embodied in the form of artistic works, design, or performances. So that is, again, that's a step in the right direction in terms of expanding the definition of what research is to include performance-based work, artistic works, alongside a couple of other changes that have happened recently as part of the PBRF refresh, so that they are now also granting institutions with Indigenous scholars additional funding. So that's in an effort to support Maori and Pacific researchers and research, and increase the weighting of research evidence portfolios submitted by Indigenous or Pacific staff. So I think that these changes are promising from the perspective of recognizing Indigenous knowledge, but what does it mean for people practicing within the performing arts industries? So creative works, obviously, they're not solely the product of the imagination. Artists examine, dissect, and even deconstruct the art that we create in order to study culture and humanity, pulling apart the techniques and references and motivations to develop knowledge of how works of art relate to the culture and society in which they are produced. If your practice-based research extends this even further by pushing the examination into a more direct and intimate sphere, observing and analyzing themselves, the artists, as they engage in the act of creation, rather than relying solely on the dissection of the art after the fact. So arts practice certainly involves many aspects of what the PBRF definition tries to articulate and a practice-based arts research degree requires the artist to carry out this original investigation towards the development of a new work. As mentioned above, due to funding body requirements, the scholarship must be captured in a way as to show sufficient evidence of originalist investigation to satisfy the requirements of government funding. So there are some challenges to the system. Academic staff are expected to collate this evidence portfolio of all of their research outputs, which there's a quality assurance criteria that's part of this, that the funding body requires the researcher to provide evidence that their research output, if it is artistic or whatever it might be, has gone through some kind of peer review process. So in an artistic sense, that could include public performance or exhibition, which again presents challenges because even though they have put a lot of consideration and thought into trying to expand the definition to be inclusive and equitable, the focus is still very much on, in my opinion, upholding traditional art organizations and structures. So there's this emphasis on fine arts, museums, dealer galleries, publications, still quite important, alongside these elite institutions. As a visual artist myself, when I was reviewing the documentation, I noticed an underrepresentation of craft object-based modes of creating and a lack of clear articulation of quality assessment criteria. And the quality assessment criteria that were there felt quite subjective to me. Of course, I understand this is a fraught area as art is so personal and difficult to quantify in many aspects, but basically the current system requires us to do that. In the performing arts, projects can combine aspects of writing, satire, exhibition, performance. It can be very multidisciplinary. And that can often take years of development. In particular, if a staff member or research student undertakes research to develop a TV script or a film script, that process can be actually quite secretive. That can't be shared publicly until the final piece is actually produced into a film or a TV series. And so that can take years, and there can be basically nothing to show for it until it's ready to be shared, which excludes that researcher from being eligible to count that as a research output in terms of funding. So that's just one example of how balancing the need for evidence of the quality of a practice-based creative output alongside the nature of the creative process and the way creative industries work requires careful consideration and navigation. So the changes to the PBRF funding that I mentioned, so the expansion of this definition and the focus on Maori and Pacifica researchers getting kind of more weighting for their work, go some way towards bridging the gap that exists. But from my perspective, I think that the funding model is still exclusionary. So, as I mentioned, we've got these challenges, but we do have some opportunities. Progress has been made. It's becoming, I think academia is becoming a more inclusive place for Indigenous people and practice-based artists. The type of work we expect the new master's program to generate will still face challenges being recognized and valued by these existing structures. But nevertheless, the opportunity to critically reflect on and engage on these issues with the wider arts and academic communities can only help broaden how we define and enact our practices and story making in Aotearoa, in my opinion. Just have water. So yeah, this last bit, librarians, we've got this. We have a very important role, I think, to play in this whole process. Art, in particular, has an amazing power to convey emotion and impact people's lives. Think about the last good piece of art you engaged with. Maybe it was a book, maybe it was a film, maybe it was music, maybe it was a painting. Did it make you laugh? Did it make you cry? Now think about the last journal article you read. Did you laugh or cry? Probably not. I would argue that art can be more powerful than a lot of these traditional research outputs. And while we might not be curing cancer here, librarians, art librarians in particular, are very important because we're helping to support the development of innovative creative practice. And we're also contributing to the impact of that work has. And as librarians, we can play an important role in supporting our organizations to be more inclusive and to uplift and celebrate work that reframes traditional concepts of research and art. When we take the time to listen to a multitude of voices, question our practices and procedures, and also model active learning, I think that's really important. We have to show that we're also learning as part of this process. The entire organization benefits. And personally, I look forward to supporting the future story makers of Toi Whakaari as they create authentic and meaningful stories, exploring identity and place that pushes the boundaries of art and research here in Te Whanganui Aotearoa. So Namihi Nui, that's thank you very much for listening. How have I done on time? And